anonymity has also been extensively employed in the art world, hasn't it? I mean, I think you talk about the US group, the Guerrilla Girls, and the British artist Banksy.
Well, Banksy is perhaps the most famously unknown artist in the world, and I love that combination, which is seemingly contradictory, that combination of terms, famous and unknown. He's a fascinating character, but one thing I want to point out is that the performance of Banksy creates a mystery of identity that has played a huge role in the fascination that exists around his artwork. And this, I think, is also the case with many others, including Elena Ferrante, the author, many artists who obscure their personal identities behind pseudonyms. Their character gets all the glory, and part of this glory stems from the mysteriousness of it all, which is quite performative. But before Banksy, there was the Guerrilla Girls, the feminist art collective born in the 1980s to slam the world of high art for its overt sexism and exclusionary nature. And both Banksy and the Guerrilla Girls perform their hidden identities as part of their art, but there's an important difference. While Banksy produces his subversive art with a unique individual pseudonym, the Guerrilla Girls have primarily performed as an anonymous group, which has allowed them to take a stand as and for women in general. The pseudonymity of Banksy allows for what I call a vicarious ego aggrandizement, the performance and promotion of and celebration of an alternate individual identity, whereas the anonymity of the Guerrilla Girls involves ego deprecation, the minimization of individualism. And they accentuate their mass community, which is a key characteristic of many anonymous social movements. So in both cases, they're creating anonymous art, but the character of the performance is quite different.
One final question. Were you able to draw any, let's say, general conclusions about the uses of anonymity and hidden identities in our late modern world?
Anonymity and pseudonymity are becoming more prevalent in the world, largely due to digital technologies. Most of all, we need to think about how anonymous acts give meaning to certain situations and how anonymity allows actors to bring certain characters to life in the world. Anonymity or pseudonymity are fundamental to the meanings of QAnon, the work of Elena Ferrante, to our understanding of addiction and recovery, our comprehension of corporate and state power, to pornography, scholarship, digital communities and forums, activism, and much, much more. And we really need a sociological view, one centered on meaning and performance, to truly understand this important and increasingly relevant aspect of the world around us.
Certainly quite a list, quite a list. Thomas de Gloma, thank you. I now have the opportunity to explore what one might call, well, the obverse of anonymity. Not so much the effacement of identity as its elaboration, the increasing manner in which celebrities and quite ordinary people seek to create elevated images of themselves, new personal brands which, well, remake reality. And this trend is the subject of a new study entitled Self-Made, Creating Our Identities from Da Vinci to the Kardashians. And its author, who now joins me from Venice, is Tara Isabella Burton, writer and visiting fellow at the George Mason University Mercatus Centre. Tara, what prompted you to write this book? Was it something in your own life? What questions did you want to explore?
A little bit, yes. I was definitely a teenage theater kid who liked Oscar Wilde too much. But more recently, my doctoral research was in theology and self-creation, looking particularly at the late 19th century dandy as a figure trying to hold on to originality in an increasingly secular but also increasingly mechanized age. I put that project away when I finished my doctorate and then realized that I wanted to go back to this idea of what it means to create ourselves as a work of art, as well as the kind of parallel myth of the American self-made man, the entrepreneur, the person who creates their life as a kind of economic force. I realized that in the era of Instagram, of the attention economy, of personal branding, those questions deserved a more considered, serious historical look, starting in the Renaissance and moving into the present day.
It is an intellectual history of self-creation, but placed in really in the context of a wider story about secular modernity. Tell me about the fit between the two elements.
For me, the idea that we not only can, but should create ourselves, that ourselves exist as something for us to create, goes hand in hand with a shift in theological assumptions, at least in the Western world, about what our relationship is to the concept of God. Are we made by a higher power, by a creator with a particular purpose? As many, for example, in medieval Christendom might have said, that God makes us whether we're king or peasant? Or is who we really are something for us to decide without recourse to an authority, be it divine or earthly? And increasingly, this obsession with the idea that we can create ourselves, that we are the only arbiters of our own life, does go hand in hand with modern secular culture. Your average person living in medieval France, say, would have seen themselves, their social position, their village, their sort of identity as part of a member of a group. Natural law meant that God didn't just create, trees and rivers and make the flowers grow in spring and die in winter, but also that God created the social order. It was something very much enshrined in the fabric of being. Starting in the Renaissance, where we see different valorization of the certain individuals, the genius, the self-made humanist, we start to see that shift. But it's really in the Enlightenment, with wholesale distrust of ideas of authority, of custom, the social order as anything sacred. And more thinkers, philosophers start asking the question, why do we do the things that we do? Is there any reason for it, or is it simply arbitrary? And if it is simply arbitrary, is it something we can change if we want to? And then in various different ways in the United States and Europe in the 19th century, we get a different theological account, you could say, where what is sacred now is not the world or the social order or something made by God, but individual feelings, individual desire. The source of authenticity, of truth, what we want is seen as constitutive of who we really are. The self-creator, whether of the entrepreneurial stripe or the aesthetic stripe, is a kind of deity, is something you find again and again in the literature of self-making. Over in Europe, you have dandies describing themselves and other dandies as miniature gods. That's a phrase that Barbey d'Aurevilly uses in his biography of Beau Brummel, which doubles as a kind of dandy manifesto. Across the pond, you have these American movements that are sort of a combination of spiritual and self-help, like New Thought, that claim that the people who want success badly enough, that visualize wealth and health intensely enough, they could harness the energies of the universe like some kind of mage or wizard and use those energies in the service of getting what they want, what we might nowadays think of as magic or the occult, but which is sort of presented in this spiritual scientific way. My favorite of the early self-help books that we can find of a sort is Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. That's 1528, I believe. It's for the would-be courtier at an Italian court, and one of the most important qualities that a courtier ought to have is what is known as sprezzatura. It's sort of untranslatable, it's very Italian, but it sort of means nonchalance, the idea that you make things look effortless. The geniuses of the world have a kind of God-given specialness that ordinary people don't have. But if you don't have it, the next best thing is to fake it. So just as today trying too hard is considered perhaps a bit embarrassing or a bit cringe, this idea of sprezzatura both grounds the notion that there's a sort of historical root to the idea of cool, but also shows that when you find an idea of a special person who has God-given talents, you're almost certain to find, around the same historical era, some kind of self-help book telling ordinary people how to pretend to have it. Is shaping public opinion, in fact, the real power a person ought to have? is a question that comes up again and again. Whether self-making is a result of hard work, whether it's God-given, or it's the result of, as the American circus impresario and hoaxer P.T. Barnum put it, a little bit of humbug.
Well, moving to the 20th century now, you explore the rise of cinema stardom and the it girl as the forerunner of self-making in our era. In what ways?
Hollywood, for me, I argue in Self-Made, is the first time that two distinct strands of self-making ideology fuse. In my book, I call them the aristocratic and the democratic. You can also call them the European and the American. The aristocratic model of the dandy self-maker is that some people are just special. They just have something that makes them better than other people. They can control their own destinies, but it's innate. You can't work for it. You just have to sort of have it or you don't. The second model, which we see more prevalent in the United States, this sort of classic American dream bootstraps model of if you just work hard enough, no matter where or how you're born, if you want it badly enough and you apply a bit of elbow grease and grit, you'll get it. In the early days of Hollywood, these narratives of discovery and innateness coalesce around the figure of the it girl. So it comes from a story by the British writer Elinor Glyn, published in Cosmopolitan in 1927, about a mysterious force that some people have and some people simply don't, a kind of sexual magnetism, the quality of stardom. Paramount recognizes a hit when they see it. They option it for $50,000, which was quite a lot in today's money for an option, even more in 1927. And they immediately make it into a film starring Clara Bow, one of the first jazz-age it girls. And the idea of this film is that this gamine flapper shop girl, played by Clara Bow, Betty Lou, simply has some mysterious star power, a kind of effortless chic that makes her so appealing that ultimately her social superior, the owner of the department store where she works as a shop girl, falls madly in love with her and leaves behind his sort of equally well-heeled fiancé and instead chooses her.
I've got a 2012 clip here from Fern Cotton's Radio 1 show. There was much excitement in the studio as she greeted Kim Kardashian, reality TV star, social media influencer, entrepreneur.
I'm going to turn the cameras on right now because the lovely Kim Kardashian is here.
How are you?
Really good. How are you, Kim?
I'm good.
Every time we see you in photos, on the TV, you look impeccable. I don't think I've ever seen you wear like a tracksuit with no makeup on.
Like pretty inspiring that all my sisters love hair and makeup. Like we don't have one tomboy in the family if you really think about it. I love makeup, I love clothes, I love being a girly girl, so it's fun for me.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about why the Kardashians not only fit into your analysis, but almost exemplify your analysis.
The Kardashians are basically the epitome of famous for being famous. And yet, what they represent is a kind of new apex in the story of the famous for being famous, it girl or influencer, precisely because they really highlight in their aesthetic the artificiality involved in performing one's own authenticity in an era where we believe that what we want makes us who we quote-unquote really are. There is a sort of hyper-authenticity, almost camp artificiality, whether it's plastic surgery, and I know that the Kardashians have been discreet about what exactly has been done, but I think it's fair to say that the aesthetic that all of the Kardashians sisters promote is one that is highly contoured, highly artificial, requires a lot of work, be it money, time in the gym, or technological and surgical enhancement. And that image, I think, really brings home this idea that the Kardashians, they have created themselves in the image of their own model, and somehow that reads to us as more authentic.
You want to say also that selling yourself has really become an integral part of American professional life as well.
I think more and more Americans today are part of, whether they want to be or not, the attention economy, whether we're talking about actual gig workers or whether it's any of us whose attention to our Instagram feeds or the news headlines we click is being monetized by others. We live in an era where self-creation, personal branding, and the desire to kind of curate our identities is not merely reserved for a special kind of person, a dandy or a high-level entrepreneur. It's expected of us. The predominant way that people meet is online now if they want to meet romantically. We have to create narratives that will be compelling enough to get us both social capital and in many cases professional success has been fully absorbed into every aspect of life. The only people, it seems, who are able to be off the grid are those who are so powerful or so wealthy or so successful that they're able to opt out. One might say that privacy has become a kind of luxury good.
In conclusion, you argue, and I'm quoting here, the idea that there is no truth beyond our personal desires makes it very hard to live in any kind of functioning or flourishing political community. Expand on that.
The more that we think of other people and society more broadly as it's simply an agent of repression that is somehow stopping us from getting in touch with our true selves, our deep selves, which we equate with the self, or our desiring selves, what we want, the more we get a kind of uneven, unbalanced sense of the self. We are less likely to see ourselves as part of communities and the things we don't choose about ourselves as being meaningful. Traditionally, especially in the United States, these ideas, this ideology of self-creation went hand in hand with very specific political and policy goals. During the Gilded Age, the idea that anyone could get rich if they wanted to meant lack of support for social services. And a lot of the great proponents of New Thought, of social Darwinism, actually railed against the expansion of social services in times of wealth inequality, because surely if you make it so that people are comfortable being poor, they won't want to be wealthy bad enough, and then they won't work hard enough. This valorization of the autonomous individual does lead to a society where more and more of us are left unmoored from community or from senses of self that are bolstered by factors we do not choose.
And you link this to the fact that so many of us now live our lives online.
Especially since the pandemic, I think that's really only increased this sense that we don't have real embodied communities that might challenge us to exist beyond the kind of identities that is so easy to put on online when people don't know us in quote-unquote real life.
Thomas de Gloma and Tara Isabella Burton, thank you both so much. This is the last programme in the present series of Thinking Aloud. We'll be back again at the end of May. Just time for a few final email reflections on last week's programme, in which Rainier Zittelmann produced the findings of an extensive survey of the manner in which capitalism is regarded in different parts of the world. Now, while some were pleased with our guest's defence of the free market, I really enjoyed your programme on capitalism. The academic really made me laugh about the lack of Marxists in Vietnam, wrote Lois Jacobs, signing herself part-time capitalist. Others, like Nick Metcalf, thought the discussion ignored the manner in which the free market created poverty, while Jeremy Payton stressed the cost to climate and the environment by capitalist greed and rapaciousness. Last words to Stephen Gardner. Quote, Dr. Zittelmann believes capitalism is fantastic, but vast numbers do not agree, bamboozled by anti-capitalist ideology. But most of the press and broadcast organisations, goes on Stephen, who mediate our understanding of how society is working, are themselves capitalist organisations. Not this one, Stephen.
Thinking Aloud is presented by Laurie Taylor and produced by Jane Edgerton. Now, this being Valentine's Day, tonight's Moral Maze will be exploring our relationship with the institution of marriage. We'll be joining Michael Burke and his guests live at 8 o'clock. This afternoon, the media show is next.
Throughout this month, Radio 2 is doing something very special.
Radio 2's Piano Room Month.
Some of our favourite artists are joining us at the Meadowvale Studios.
Hi, I'm Beverly Knight. I'm Pippi Arnold.
I'm Guy Garvey from Melbourne.
Giving us unique live performances alongside the BBC Concert Orchestra.
Radio 2's Piano Room Month continues throughout February.
Watch on iPlayer, listen on BBC Sounds.
Now here on Radio 4, here's Katie Razzle with The Media Show.
Hello. Is traditional broadcast TV dead? Piers Morgan seems to think so. He's leaving his nightly TV show and setting up shop on YouTube. And Walt Disney is teaming up with the makers of the Fortnite game. We'll find out why. But we're going to start by looking at what's next in Prince Harry's dispute with the tabloids. Last week, the Prince settled his outstanding claims with the Mirror titles, but only after he'd taken them to court, where a judge ruled the Prince had been the subject of extensive phone hacking by Mirror Group newspapers. Earlier, I spoke to Evan Harris, former MP, now a legal analyst who's part of the team working for Prince Harry and others in their claims against various newspapers.
Most people may have heard about Prince Harry settling, but readers of the Mirror will not have heard about his success last week, because typically, one might say, the Mirror didn't think it was newsworthy to publish the fact that it had conceded the rest of Harry's claim, even though it led the news on almost every other outlet, certainly all broadcast outlets. In this case, Prince Harry had made clear that he wasn't going to settle, and he'd take the financial risk of not settling because he wanted to make sure that there were findings and that there was accountability, so that the facts came out about what was being done to everyone. In fact, most of the trial was not about him, and also that if findings were made of criminal conduct, which there were, albeit on a civil standard of proof, in a civil trial, then there would be the opportunity for the police and the authorities to investigate, which you would expect in a country that respects the rule of law. The reason why most people do settle, though, is because if you don't beat a financial offer you're given and you go to trial, then you've not achieved anything and you have to pay the costs of the other side.
OK, so we've got this finding when it comes to Mirror Group newspapers and Prince Harry, but there are other upcoming cases. Could you just talk us briefly through what's coming down the line?
Yes, before I do that, because there are 3 litigations, it's important to note the extent of the findings in the Mirror, because it wasn't just findings that he'd been hacked. The judge said it is beyond doubt, even though it was in a civil trial, that the editors knew about the unlawful information gathering and voicemail interception. That's pretty much a direct quote from the judgment. That's a finding of fact. And this is important because people say, well, surely it's over now. Well, the judge found that there was dishonesty by the Mirror Group in their defence, even in the trial. So if they're not telling the truth now, and there's been no accountability because the police haven't done the job yet, then how can the public be certain that this has ended?
Talk me through upcoming cases. We've heard about the Mirror. What else is to come?
Similar allegations are being made by Prince Harry and others against News Group newspapers, which is part of News UK and owned by Rupert Murdoch, and against Associated Newspapers, which publishes the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday. And those are due for resolution, if the timetable is stuck to, in 2025, and then for Associated a bit later. Against Associated, the claims are of phone hacking, other unlawful information gathering, including blagging, that's obtaining private information by deception, commissioned burglaries, believe it or not, break-ins of houses, usually to plant bugs, this is what's alleged, the placing of trackers on cars, and
this is all denied by Associated Newspapers, just to be clear.
Well, we haven't seen their defence yet. In their public statements, they vehemently deny it, but they hadn't sought to strike it out as groundless, which is interesting. They had the opportunity to do that. News Group newspapers have admitted some activity on the news desk and the features desk for a period at the News of the World, but have never admitted any liability on the Sun. But
and
they
still
have,
continue to say that.
indeed,
but
they've made significant payments to people who are only bringing claims against the Sun. They say it's cheaper for them to spend whatever it costs to settle these cases than to spend £10 million on a trial.
And they may be right.
Well, they've so far spent £500 million in settlements and lawyers' costs avoiding this £10 million trial. So I suggest that actually the reason they want to avoid the trial is they don't want these witnesses to appear, they don't want the documents to come into the public domain, and they don't want a judge to make findings. And if this was any other industry, the press, or at least the rest of the press, would be demanding that answers were given.
Clearly you don't speak for the Prince, but he is on a mission to clean up the media. What kinds of reforms does he want?
Well, I'm not sure how engaged he is on the detail of what the Leveson inquiry proposed, but certainly those people like me and others who have seen what damage the newspapers have done, we want to see the Leveson recommendations implemented, which means, for example, there should be an independent regulator, not a pet regulator controlled by the press.
That's what you say IPSO is, the body that regulates newspapers and magazines.
Yes.
Why do you think it's not working?
Well, it's not just me. There's an independent assessor of regulators that says that if it's not independent of the newspapers and the newspaper industry, then it can't be an independent regulator, self-evidently, and that it ought to be something that can do what's called standards investigations like Ofcom do. IPSO, in its 7-8 years existence, has not done a single investigation on standards, therefore has created no sanctions against any newspaper and levied no fines, not a single fine. And
IPSO says its key thing is to improve standards, and the way it does that is, standards investigations, it says, would be the last resort. They don't have them because they find that in the 8 years since they've been established, they work with publishers to improve standards, and that's an effective approach.
Well, it's not just me that says that. If you look at polls of international comparative polls, like ones done by the Reuters Foundation, we find that Britain is the lowest of all European countries on trust in the media, especially the press, because no one seriously believes that there has been no incident by the press, whether it be the lies told about Hugh Edwards, whether it be Jeremy Clarkson's column on Meghan Markle, whether it be the harassment of Caroline Flack. No one believes that there is nothing that the press can be found to have got wrong in the last 8 years.
Can I just ask, proprietors argue that stricter regulations infringe on their fundamental right to freedom of expression, and that could lead to government censorship or stifle investigative journalism. What's your response to that argument?
It's a preposterous argument. I mean, it would stifle freedom of expression of proprietors to do what they like and run roughshod, but independent regulation of the Ofcom kind, which has a sort of due impartiality rule that wouldn't apply to newspapers, that doesn't stifle the ability of Sky, ITV, the BBC, or even highly partial broadcasters like GB News and Talk TV to hold politicians to account. People care not just about free speech, of course, they care about the right to privacy. And, when you've got findings made, and we don't know if it's still going on, that people's medical records were obtained unlawfully and their bank accounts were obtained unlawfully, I don't think that the protestations of media moguls or their employees counts for much.
Well, that was Evan Harris talking to me earlier. Academic and journalist Jane Martinson, who is the former head of media at The Guardian, is here in the studio with me. I wonder, Jane, hello, what's your take on what Evan Harris is saying there?
I mean, I think, it's really interesting what he was saying. He's right to talk about this sort of, the long-running saga, 11 years since it first really, well, more actually, when it first was revealed by The Guardian, the extent of phone hacking. I think the issue of trust in the media is a huge one, and as I wrote just before Christmas, when Prince Harry was awarded the 146,000 or so from the Mirror Group,
which has since gone up obviously with his other settlements.
Yeah, although we don't know exactly how much through, but I mean this entire scandal has cost the industry hundreds of millions, and I am sympathetic to the view that, and I wrote about what we sort of need is for the industry to feel, and for a cultural shift, I think, to take greater recognition of what it needs to do to try to improve their behaviour around even this scandal. I mean, I totally accept Evan's point about non-coverage, because that was the thing that was most marked to me the day after that initial sort of win by Prince Harry against the Mirror. Very few papers even covered it properly, and those that did led quite large on Piers Morgan, the former editor, which I think we're going to talk about later, his real criticism of Prince Harry and denial. So
I just wondered, do you agree with his call for a sort of stronger state regulator?
See, that's where I differ with Evan Harris, and we've talked about it over the many years. I mean, I was at The Guardian as head of media when Nick Davis and the paper were running brilliant sort of exposures of this. But I think the argument that state-backed regulation is somehow going to be a panacea, I cannot see that that is right. I know they're not arguing for state control. However, we do need to have a greater awareness of that self-regulation needs to be seen to work. There needs to be more transparency, more suggestion that the media itself as an industry should be held to account by itself. You know, we as journalists, and you know, I always start from the basis of this scandal and many scandals were first revealed by journalism. This was not the police, it was not the government or ministers who revealed this, it was journalists who did it. But actually what they're very bad at as an industry, and I am generalising, there are obviously real sort of attempts to do so, is holding themselves to account, where we see with the reaction when we have verdicts like this, you know, the Mirror not even reporting on the settlement or on what actually went on.
Though they did report on the court case originally, I do remember that, but the weapon ultimately wielded by a regulator, for example, would be fines. Many in the newspaper industry would argue, you know, they're already under enough financial pressure. Do we really want to see newspapers closing? What would you say to that?
Well, I think I've got lots of sympathy for that actually, because I think we don't want to lose a really good investigative journalism and the way the industry has moved, and the fact that the internet has provided all these new, I mean, to me.
Yes, hello. I'm alright. I'm heading now today. Yes, I'm heading out to exit 10, yeah, and I will be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes I'll be there. Yes, and I will need to call you when I'm outside, because I'm going to park outside, or how it's going to be. Oh, okay, no worries, alright. Okay, no worries. Thank you. Bye.
Piers Morgan looming, as he does. You know, he you know, told me that he's kind of thrilled to be getting out of the business of showing up in a studio every night between 8 and 9 p.m. to, you know, to jam interviews and talk into this sort of fixed hour-long format. And this is actually true. He's been incredibly successful on YouTube with a much kind of shaggier, looser, looser way of doing media. I mean, I think he's, you know, they're making a virtue out of necessity, I think. I mean, the notion that you're going to build a new television network in the year 2024 is a long shot. And I think, obviously, his departure for Talk TV is not a sign of the success of Talk TV and building an audience. And it sounds to, as a foreign observer, it looks like they've had trouble competing with GB News, which is just much more stridently to their right.
I mean, we should be clear that he's moving on to Talk TV's YouTube channel, so it's not, you know, he already
he's not
Piers
even
Morgan and Talk TV own Uncensored together.
Yes,
but as you say, you know, if you look at, I was just looking at the numbers. I mean, how is the show performing on the Talk TV channel as opposed to the YouTube channel? I mean, it's a huge difference, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, he sees himself getting 60,000 people watching it on television and hundreds of thousands watching on the internet, and, you know...
2.3 million subscribers on YouTube, I think.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is both is basically trying to put the best face on something that isn't really working, which is to say linear television, but also that is liberating him to do something that most people with big television contracts can't do, which is try to shape his actual programming for an online audience. And if you look at the best stuff he's done, like he had this incredible interview with the Egyptian comic, Egyptian Bassem Youssef, which went totally off the rails. And Youssef showed up in character, making these incredibly dark jokes about his own relatives in Gaza and him, hoping they died. Really strange. And Morgan just was able to lean into it and let it unspool. And it's watched 22 million times, and it's really extraordinary television. Some of it. I mean, he's a very talented broadcaster. I think an underlying question, though, is that the economics of linear television in the United States more than in the UK, but still work. And the reason these highly paid, Morgan is reportedly under a £50 million pound 3-year contract. The reason these highly paid broadcasters stay on television is because it pays the bills. Very hard for me to see how even those numbers on YouTube will pay him his salary.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I was going to raise that £50 million 3-year deal that he's reported to have signed. Where does this leave that, do you think? And what does it mean for Talk TV as well?
I think it means Talk TV isn't long for this world. That is my guess. The uninformed guess. He's getting paid from like 8 different News Corp and Fox Corp Murdoch family institutions. Sky Australia has a piece of it. The sort of cursed Fox Nation, their kind of doomed streaming effort in the US has a piece of it. And they're all still picking up the tab. At some level, for the greater glory of Piers Morgan, because none of those platforms seem to really be catching on.
Jay Martinson, just I wonder what your take on this was. 50 miles per hour.
Yeah, and I loved the piece, Ben's piece in Semaphore. It really made me laugh with the sort of Piers interview from the back of the car, turning off his camera.
Not knowing how to turn off his camera.
My favorite part was that he said, I don't know how to turn the camera off.
Yeah, so it was a Zoom interview in a car with the camera still on because he didn't know how to turn it off.
Camera's always on.
I think you should stream that live, actually, Ben. That would be fun. As Ben said, he has had great success on YouTube, actually, and people love watching, and he is actually a very entertaining interviewer. It does smack slightly of conceding defeat, I think, if not for Piers, because he's already done the deal. He's earning a huge amount of money from all around the various global parts of the Rupert Murdoch empire. But Talk TV, what does it say? To me, what I'm interested in talking about regulation, what does it say about opinionated television in the UK? I've just done a thing on Ofcom, a state-backed regulator who is slightly struggling with the direct competitor to Talk TV, GB News, which is actually getting bigger numbers and making a much bigger fuss by being much to the right, really opinionated, and not necessarily listening to rules about broadcast television.
And it's probably worth saying Ofcom won't regulate items that go onto YouTube rather than
which is a much bigger issue of all this whole debate. Links nicely with what we were talking about earlier.
Okay, well, thank you both. But I wanted to have time to talk about DJ Steve Wright and the tributes that have been pouring in for the man who presented programmes for BBC Radio 1 and Radio 2 for